He represents us right here in California's 28th Congressional District, and he is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Please welcome back Congressman Adam Schiff. So let's start with this. Recently, a lot of Republicans on the Intelligence Committee have been calling for your resignation. Anything to say to them now?
Yes, read the report. Look, it's been a sad fact on our committee now for a year and a half with my ranking member, Mr. Nunes, that basically when the White House says jump, I'm not talking about the cow here, because that would get applause, I'm sure. When the president says jump, he says how high. And it was choreographed by the White House before that committee meeting a couple weeks ago. This was their stratagem. And it's a disservice to our committee and the Congress, but it is what it is.
So let's talk about this report. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot still redacted. Did anything really surprise you today when you saw the details of the document?
You know, it wasn't really so much that surprised me. We knew about many of the interactions between the Trump campaign and the Russians. We knew certainly about some of the acts of obstruction. What the report did was go into granular detail about these in a way that we hadn't seen before, and new instances of misconduct. But, you know, the top line is this is 300 to 400 pages of damning conduct by the President of the United States and people around him, multiple lies and falsehoods, the urging of other people to lie on his behalf, illicit contacts between his campaign and the Russians' efforts to interfere in our elections in a massive way, the president's efforts to obstruct that investigation. Among those hundreds of pages, there is not a single page that reflects well on the President of the United States. And that is not a cause for exoneration, vindication, or anything like it. It is a cause for condemnation. And I'll tell you, if I were on the part of your show where you do the Wheel of Rant,
close, but sure, yeah.
What I would be ranting about at the moment is our Attorney General, who I think terribly misled the country repeatedly. There were, as we suspected, summaries of Mueller's work in Mueller's own words that this Attorney General chose not to use. He chose instead to tell a false narrative that the President wanted to put out there. And I think he views himself, sadly, as the President's personal lawyer, not as the Attorney General of the United States.
So now that we have the report, is there any justification for having released that 4-page summary that isn't political, that isn't partisan on behalf of the President?
There's no justification whatsoever. If the Attorney General, acting in good conscience, wanted to release a summary so that the country wouldn't have to wait for whatever redactions to take place, he could have released Mueller's summary. In fact, when you look at Mueller's summaries in the report, there are very few redactions from the summaries. So there was no reason to do that, except for the fact that Barr wanted to do two things. He wanted to please the boss by pushing out this false narrative of no collusion, no obstruction. And second, he wanted to arrogate to himself, before people read the report, that it was his job to decide that the evidence of obstruction could not result in a prosecution of the president, when it's clear that the report itself believed that those kind of decisions about what should follow from the president's many acts of obstruction were to be left to Congress, not to Bill Barr.
So do you think that Bill Barr deserves, do you believe he should resign? Do you believe that if he doesn't resign, he deserves to face an impeachment inquiry of his own?
I don't know what the consequences should be for Barr. I do know this, and I've said this ever since his confirmation hearing, there is no way that this man should have been confirmed for the job in the first place. And you know, for that reason, I think when they write this chapter of history, some of the most damning language will be reserved not just for Donald Trump, but for the Republicans in Congress who refuse to stand up to this deeply unethical, immoral human being in the Oval Office. That Barr could audition for the job by writing that 19-page legal diatribe, and that any Senate would confirm someone with such an obvious bias against the investigation without demanding his recusal is inexcusable. And you know, the only people who the report reflects on in a positive way at all, and who would have thunk it, are the people who refused to do the president's bidding. And one of them happened to be Barr's predecessor, Jeff Sessions, who refused to ignore the advice of ethics lawyers.
Isn't that interesting that in this document, no, it is fascinating that Jeff Sessions seems to be, it's it's a low standard, but one of the only people inside of this institution with an eye on what his actual genuine responsibilities are.
No, that's very true. Look, Barr, when he was asked during his confirmation, will you seek the advice of ethics lawyers? Will you follow the advice? His answer was no. Jeff Sessions at least had the standing and backbone to say, I'm not going to ignore what the ethics lawyers are telling me.
Yeah, it's that when Johnny Carson interviewed a journalist who'd been covering the Nixon investigations, and what that journalist said was, in all the documents and all the tapes, there's never a point at any point that anyone says this is wrong, that what we're doing is wrong. And we have a 400-page document, and there is literally no place anywhere, unless I missed it, where anyone raises a moral objection. There do seem to be moments when someone says, I can't do that, I'll get in trouble. But there seems to be no one at any point in this process around collusion or obstruction where someone said, hold on, this isn't the right thing to do.
Unfortunately, that's exactly right. In all of these contexts, these approaches made by the Russians, this hostile foreign power, and probably the most graphic, of course, is that involving this secret meeting at the Trump Tower in New York, where the Russians offered dirt on Hillary Clinton as part of what they describe as the Russian government effort to help the Trump campaign. What is the Trump campaign reaction? Absolutely not, we're going to report you to the FBI. It's Don Jr. saying, if it's what you say it is, I'd love it. And that's the attitude that permeates this whole report, which is, hey, if you're going to help us through social media, by pushing out divisive content, or through hacking dumping operation, whatever, we would love it. Now, Mueller concluded that's no crime. Maybe it should be, but he concluded that's no crime. But it is so unethical and immoral and unpatriotic that all of us on both sides of the aisle should condemn it.
I also, it was pretty fascinating to see Don Jr. today basically take a victory lap because the report concludes that he was too stupid to realize he was committing criminal offenses. So let's talk about obstruction. Mueller talks a lot about the role of Congress in this report. Yoni Applebaum in The Atlantic described the report as an impeachment referral, laying out not only a ton of evidence for obstruction, but also the legal basis for placing the responsibility in Congress's hands. Do you agree with that description of this report?
I do agree that what Mueller did was provide all the documentation, all the evidence that he accumulated on these, for example, 10 instances of obstruction of justice, and submit it to Congress and say, basically, I'm not allowed to indict. If I were able to make that judgment, I could not conclude that a crime didn't occur here. But I'm not allowed to make that judgment. And here's another area where Bill Barr misled the country in suggesting that factor that you couldn't indict a sitting president wasn't something the special counsel was considering. That was foremost in his consideration. Instead, Mueller said that there are remedies for a president who either violates the law or is unfit for office, and it's the Congress. And so this evidence needs to go to the Congress, and also, by the way, this evidence needs to be preserved so that when the president is out of office, the Justice Department can consider indicting him then.
So your colleague Steny Hoyer said earlier today, based on what we have seen to date, going forward on impeachment is not worthwhile at this point. Very frankly, there is an election in 18 months and the American people will make a judgment. Since then, he has walked that back and said he wants to see the full report and he believes all options should be on the table. You told a man whose name is Wolf Blitzer, impossibly, but you said this about impeachment. The evidence would have to be quite overwhelming and demonstrable and such that it would generate bipartisan support for the idea that it renders the president unfit for office. This is something we talked about back in February on this stage, something you've written about. There's a phrase in there that's doing a lot of work. You say, and such that. Like, what if the evidence is overwhelming, but that still doesn't create the bipartisan support?
Well, it's a problem because it means that members of Congress won't do their constitutional duty, that they view their job as not defending our institutions, whether it's the co-equal branches of government or the freedom of the press, but rather as acting as an extension of Rudy Giuliani. And that's a problem, and that's a serious problem that we've had all along. I don't think we take anything off the table, and I think it is insupportable for the Justice Department to simultaneously take the position you can't indict a sitting president, but unless you begin an impeachment proceeding, we're not going to show you the grand jury material that would help you determine whether you should bring an impeachment proceeding. I think this is why the grand jury secrecy rules have a provision that says preliminary to such a proceeding, you can provide this information to Congress. So we're going to get that information. We're going to go after that information, and we should reserve judgment until we see all the evidence about what the right remedy is.
But on this question of the bipartisan basis of impeachment, doesn't it beg the question? Because in the same way that you're saying you can't have the information from the grand jury until you pursue impeachment, but you don't want to pursue impeachment until you have the information. Isn't one of the ways that we make an impeachment inquiry bipartisan by making the case? By saying, here's why we believe Donald Trump ought to be impeached, because despite our sadness at the truth of it, he clearly committed obstruction of justice, and therefore we want to get to the bottom of it through this inquiry. Isn't saying from the start that we can't pursue impeachment till it's bipartisan, kind of giving up before you've begun?
It doesn't mean, just because you want to see the evidence before you initiate an impeachment proceeding, doesn't mean that you're not doing investigative work. We are. In my committee, in the Judiciary Committee, in the Oversight Committee, we are continuing our investigations. And that may very well produce, quite in addition to what Bob Mueller did, the evidence necessary to take additional steps like impeachment. We shouldn't prejudge it. But the fact that we don't begin with an impeachment proceeding doesn't mean we're not doing the hard spade work of making the information public so that we can see whether there's a bipartisan consensus that this means the president is unfit for office. So that work goes on. And I'll add to that, the Mueller report looked at essentially 2 or 3 things. It looked at the social media operation, looked at the hacking and dumping operation. It looked at the illicit contacts between the Russians and the Trump campaign. It did not, for the most part, follow the money. And that is what we're determined to do on the Intelligence Committee and the Financial Service Committee. There's no discussion of whether the Russians were laundering money through the Trump organization, and this is leverage that the Russians are applying over the President of the United States. And indeed, one of the points that Mueller makes in his report is that simultaneously to the criminal investigation, there was an ongoing counterintelligence investigation to determine whether the president or others around him were acting wittingly or unwittingly as agents of a foreign power. So we need to get that evidence. As Mueller points out, that some of that evidence is not even included in the report, and that also will be important for us to determine what consequences are necessary to protect the country.
So, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that there is a vast amount we still don't know, that there's a lot of evidence that could change people's minds, a lot of evidence of criminality we have no idea about yet, that the Mueller investigation was limited in scope. But on obstruction, right, Richard Nixon, one of the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon was obstruction of justice. Bill Clinton was impeached by Republicans on perjury and obstruction of justice. We have a tremendous amount of evidence of obstruction of justice. It is hard to imagine there being more evidence that would change the mind of someone who is currently saying that there's nothing there. They look at this report and they say there's nothing there. If the standard is that impeachment has to be bipartisan and only one party believes in the rule of law, doesn't that mean the rule of law only applies to one party?
It does mean that the system is broken, that our democracy is very much at risk. The fact that there is no longer any John McCain, that there's no Baker of this generation to go to the president and say, essentially, your conduct is so unbecoming of a president of the United States, demonstrating such unfitness for office that unless you leave, we're going to have to remove you. There is no one of backbone willing to stand up to this president. And yes, that means that the democracy is trembling because we don't have that kind of check and balance. I mean, the Republicans in Congress, Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, won't even defend Congress's most important power, the power of the purse. What hope is there that they'll do the right thing vis-a-vis the other areas in which the President of the United States is violating our system of checks and balances? So yes, it does mean the system is broken. But I don't take the view that if you build it, they will come. I think we need to continue the investigative work. We have to hope that we can win over our GOP colleagues to see their duty rather than their party. And if they don't, there isn't much of a remedy except the ballot box.
But see, Democrats in the House can impeach Donald Trump based on the evidence we have right now. I don't know about you. I'm someone who read the report today. You see classified information. You've been deep in this investigation. You read the report today. Do you believe, based on what we know right now, that Donald Trump committed obstruction of justice?
I do, and I believe for quite some time that he is unfit for office.
And do you believe that obstruction of justice is an impeachable offense?
Obstruction of justice is unquestionably an impeachment offense, an impeachable offense. The question at the moment is there any hope of a conviction? Or are we just advocating putting the president through the trial in the House? Is the trial in of itself valuable, worthwhile enough, even if there's no prospect of conviction? Now, maybe it's my training as a prosecutor, but as a prosecutor, our view was always, unless you believed you could get a conviction, you didn't try the case even if you felt the defendant was guilty. And I think that what an impeachment proceeding would mean if we bring it about prematurely, before we see all the evidence, before we determine whether we have a plausible case with our colleagues in the Senate, is that it means all of the rest of our agenda, our efforts to create better paying jobs for people and a higher income, our efforts to expand healthcare, all of that is pushed aside. And that's a huge sacrifice. At the end of the day, I think what's going to matter most to people in 2020 is what we're doing to improve the quality of people's lives, and I don't think we can ever lose sight of that.
Okay. When Robert Mueller testifies, what are you interested in asking him about?
Well, in our committee, and I think we will differ from the Judiciary Committee in this. The Judiciary Committee is going to be predominantly concerned with the obstruction of justice issues. We are going to be concerned with what we have been focused on in our committee from the very beginning, which is this investigation began in order to look to whether the president and people around him were compromised by a foreign power and taking actions that were against the interests of the United States because they were compromised. Now, that compromise could be the laundering of money by the Russians. It could have been Moscow Trump Tower. The president of the United States, while deceiving the country during the campaign, was seeking to make the most lucrative deal of his life in Moscow, and one that required the approval of the Kremlin, the same Kremlin in which he was praising Vladimir Putin at the time. That is deeply compromising. If there is other compromise, either by the Gulf states, the Kushner family seeking financing, and that accounts for why the president can't criticize the Crown Prince, even when it involves the murder of a U.S. person, Khashoggi. If the reason he can criticize anybody but apparently Putin and Kim Jong-un and the Crown Prince is because he still wants to build this tower in Moscow, then we need to know it, we need to expose it, we need to take legislative steps to protect the country.
One final question. Burger King is testing an impossible burger, an impossible Whopper, a vegetarian, I believe vegan Whopper. I know that you are a vegan. Are you excited about this? It's currently being tested in St. Louis. Is there legislation you can introduce to have that testing period move to vegan places like LA?
You know, this is a very serious question. The others were not so much serious, but this one really is. And you may not recall that the last time I was on your show, I did my rant about vegan burgers that are served on a non-vegan bun. So the question is, does Burger King use a non-vegan bun? Because if they don't, I'm going to be pissed.
And hopefully there will be a bipartisan basis to get to the bottom of that. Chairman Adam Schiff, thank you so much. Proud to be represented by you every day. Thank you for being here.